Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I'm sorry if I seem a little groggy this morning. I live in Toronto, so all the fresh air and lack of gunfire really kept me up last night. As we say in Toronto, if you don't like the neighborhood, just wait 10 minutes and eventually the super will burn down your apartment to get the insurance money. Ontario, yours to discover. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be here this morning. I'm very happy to be addressing the BC Teachers Federation. Well, partly because I'm I believe very strongly in the work you guys are doing with social justice in the classroom. But mostly, I'm happy to be here because as I look around, I can see that you all are a very, very attractive group of people. So give yourselves a hand for that. Yeah. Get them on your side with flattery. Check. Now, before I begin, I just have to let you know that I am not a licensed educator. I didn't go to university for anthropology or sociology or any of the other ologies. I was an English major, which basically means I'm qualified to recite Byron's and Keats while I'm standing in the unemployment line. Yeah! UIC. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint presentation, but if you like computer graphics, I can put my Facebook page up on the screen to see how many friends send me farm bill requests every month. So what qualifies me to come speak to you about social justice in the BC school system? Well, for one thing, I grew up as an Aboriginal in the BC school system. I grew up Aboriginal in a lot of places, actually, but today I'd like to talk about my experiences as an Aboriginal in this province's school system. Now, the reason I believe that my experience applies here today is because it's very similar to the experience of many of the Aboriginal youth that you have had in your classrooms over the years. But I was one of them. I was educated in the mainstream public school system and in schools on the reserve. Now, I am that native guy that was raised in the city and on reserve. You know, that native guy that CBC likes to make TV movies about. And you guys have seen the commercials. Torn between two worlds. A stranger in his own land. And the only thing that can lead him home is the spirit of the ancestors. Insert drums and you will cry here. Now, as cliche as those stories are, there is a modicum of truth to that struggle. Which brings me to my very unscientific thesis statement: Native students are different. Now, before the sociologists in the crowd start lighting torches and rush the stage with pitchforks, bear with me and let me explain where I'm coming from. See, when you grow up Native in Canada, you learn very early on that you are very different from the rest of the country. This becomes very evident at a very early age. Right from birth, to prepare us for the multiple identity issues we will inevitably face later on in life, we start our existence bombarded by the political correctness merry-go-round. Or, as I like to call it, what is the acceptable term for Indians this week? Now, when I was a kid, we were called, we were called Indians. It was widely accepted, heard it all the time in Westerns. Mind you, the term is usually preceded by the other adjectives like stinkin', murderin', and drunken, but still it's always nice to be recognized. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, the natives grew restless. "We're not Indians," they exclaimed. "Indians are from India." So the global representatives from the League of Political Correctness determined that we are now called Native Canadians. Fine. It's neat, tidy, and all-inclusive. But then the natives grew restless again. "We are not Canadians," they exclaimed. "Canada is the name of the country that oppressed us." So, being the can't-we-all-get-along country that we are, Canadians were bombarded with a multitude of politically correct names that some natives find offensive and some don't. Some natives use these terms and some don't, making it virtually impossible for any non-native to use a correct term 100% of the time. I mean, it has gotten so bad that when you go home tonight and describe your day, the only way that you'll be able to cover all your bases is if you say, "Hi, honey, you should have heard this Native Canadian, Aboriginal, Native American, First Nations, American Indian, Status Treaty, and Franchise Original Peoples speaker we had today." Now, personally, I think all dark people should just go under one politically correct term: persons of pigment. I'm going to let you in on a little secret, though. When our people refer to each other, we actually just call each other Indians. Now, I don't know who started this entire PC hullabaloo. I don't know if it was native people or non-natives, but all I know is that I never once got a phone call from an Ipsos Reid poll asking me what I wanted to be called. Okay, now, not having a moniker that everyone can agree on may not seem like a big deal, but it is the tip of the iceberg of a problem that faces many Native youth today: identity. It certainly has affected me. I mean, as I mentioned before, I would have lived in both worlds, the city and on reserve. Now, other than a short jaunt to my reserve when I was a baby, I pretty much spent my early years amongst the concrete world of Canadian multiculturalism, or cultural mosaic, as we like to call it. In other words, everyone is equal, every culture is special, viva la différence! But for the most part, growing up, I didn't really notice any difference between myself and the other kids, personality-wise. But I did notice that I was much browner than the others. In fact, I was the brownest kid on the block. Whenever we couldn't afford a costume on Halloween, I just hold up a large piece of glass in front of me and say that I was a glass of chocolate milk. So I was different, noticeably so. And I thought I would always be the standout in the community. I mean, this was my identity. Until the day the African-Canadian family moved into the neighborhood. Now, I'm not using that term to be politically correct. I mean, these guys had Canadian citizenship, but they were straight from Africa. I mean, wow. So I was no longer the curiosity on the block. My identity as the neighborhood pigmented person was completely usurped. I suddenly felt as pale as Casper, white as a Winnipeg winter, as pointless as the Toronto Maple Leafs. Get them on your side with anti-Toronto sentiment? Check. Now remember, this African family moved to Vancouver in the 1970s, where black families were still mostly an Eastern Canada phenomenon. This was way before that time in Canadian history, when homesteaders flocked west to tame the vast expanse of the British Columbia landscape, otherwise known as the Great Migration of Expo 86. Well, needless to say, I became friends with the new African arrival, and please forgive me, I forget what he was called. It was a long time ago, and there's a lot of consonants in his name. But for our purposes, let's just call him Jim. Now, together, Jim and I changed the face of West Vancouver forever. We brought ethnicity to the masses. I was fascinated by Jim and his African ways. When it was time for dinner at Jim's house, they all washed their faces and hands in a bowl. A bowl! And they had a sink 5 feet away. I mean, how kick-ass is that, man? The family could speak English, but preferred to converse in a language that they all understood, but sounded like Klingon to me. They told stories about their homeland and the rituals and songs and about belonging to a tribe. They knew where they came from. They knew who they were. They had a culture. Now, I knew from a very early age that I was a Native Canadian, Aboriginal, Native American, First Nations, American Indian, Status Treaty Enfranchised Original Peoples, Indian. I knew this because my family told me, but in some unexplainable way, I also felt it. I mean, even though half of my genealogical makeup was Scottish and Greek, my family never suggested I eat haggis or toss a log. And on the Greek side, they never encouraged me to smash my dinner plates. So as far as they were concerned, I was an Indian. And from birth to this very day, I have always lived just as an Indian. The only problem was, unlike Jim, I knew nothing about my language, or about my homeland, or rituals, or songs, or about belonging to a tribe. I had no culture. Thus began my search for belonging, for my identity as a first inhabitant. And someday, Creator willing, I too would wash my face in a bowl. Now, my mother was very supportive of trying to help me on my path to self-discovery. However, being of Scottish and Greek ancestry, her knowledge of Native awareness was about as limited as the rest of mainstream Canada. I mean, sure, she did live on a reserve for a short period of time and was involved in a passionate whirlwind taboo-breaking marriage with a militant First Nations anarchist/anarchist who would later be put on the watchdog list of the FBI and CSIS. But who among us hasn't been in that relationship, right, people? So with her limited knowledge of Native culture, but well-meaning heart, she taught me about my roots, the way most Canadians learn about Native culture, academically. She told me that I was from the Shuswap nation, which was situated near a faraway magical land known as Kamloops, where manna fell from the sky, buffalo roamed freely, and the streets were paved with gold. This sounded amazing. Can we see it, Mom? Can we see the land of my people? What, are you crazy? I ain't going back to that redneck dust bowl. So instead of returning me to my Mecca, my mother tacked up a map of Canada that had all the tribes of Canada illustrated on it. Well, not all the tribes, really. The Shuswaps weren't there. It mostly focused on what I like to call the Big Six: the Haida, Coast Salish, Cree, Ojibwe, Algonquin, and Mi'kmaq. Oh, and at the time, there was a big group of people at the top of the map, then known as Eskimos. But we didn't pay too much attention to them at the time. I find it amazing that what a gas pipeline and the discovery of diamond mines will do for people's recognizability factor. I learned about Waxbar woman played by Raquel Welch. And I learned about Yellowhand, played by Anthony Quinn. Basically, I learned that my ancestors looked a lot like white people in brown makeup and bad wigs. My mother even started making bannock, lots and lots of bannock, or fried bread for those of you that aren't native or voyageurs. So from the get-go, I can say that my Aboriginal education was more or less strictly historical, or, and this is an important distinction, based on a history that mainstream Canada felt comfortable teaching. And although I didn't realize it at the time, this perception of what a real Indian was or is supposed to be would be the basis for the majority of the work I would do throughout my life, academically, in my writing, acting, producing, and even my comedy. And when I started public school, I found that this perception of Native history would go on to shape my self-esteem, my worldview as an Aboriginal, and define my place as a citizen of this great Dominion of Canada. Now, needless to say, from the moment I started school as an Aboriginal boy, I began to realize just how different I was from my classmates. And from the first grade, I was enrolled in Britannia Elementary in Vancouver's East Side. At the time, the school was the epitome of 1970s social liberalism. There was no desks, we all sat on the floor, and every newsletter was the size of a Stephen King novella, because they were published in 17 different languages. But the great thing about the school was, for the first time I can remember, I was with other Native children. I mean, this was great. I was finally with my people. I had found my tribe. And just then, a Coast Salish girl came running out of nowhere and started kicking me in the shins. It was then that I learned my first lesson in Aboriginal diplomacy. Native people are very protective of their traditional territories. Now, the other great thing about the school was that they had a special program for the different kids, or rather the Aboriginal kids. It was called Cultural Studies or something like that. It was even run by a real-life Indian, which in those days is pretty cool. So every day, the Aboriginal kids would be rounded up, herded together, and placed in a tiny little area away from the non-Native kids to get a separate education. Sound familiar? We always left class at the same hour every day. I assumed that while we were in cultural studies, the other kids were being taught Caucasian studies. I always imagined that the second we left the classroom, the teacher would lean into the remaining students and say, "Okay, kids, now here's something else that Native kids aren't supposed to know." So, even as Native kids, our education in cultural studies started the way most Canadian youth study Aboriginal cultures today, anthropologically. How did these primitive people live? What tools did these primitive people use? How did these primitive people hunt? And most importantly, where did these primitive people live? And that is the constant and pervasive word when it comes to learning about Native cultures: primitive. So, like most Canadian kids, the first thing we learned about was Native habitats. Now, the options available to us were Haida, Coast Salish, Cree, Ojibwe, Algonquin, and Mi'kmaq. Once again, the Big Six. The problem was, I'm Shuswap, and instinctually, we didn't live in longhouses, or instinctually, I knew we didn't live in longhouses or teepees. We lived in quiggly huts or pit dwellings. So I chose Cree, because it seemed like the closest to my people. And I have to say, for a Shuswap, the popsicle stick teepee I made was pretty darn good. We also learned, like most Canadian youth do, about Native creation stories, or as they're referred to in the syllabus, folklore, myths, and fables. We learned about how Coyote put everything in order for the coming of the human beings. We learned how Glooskap turned himself into a giant beaver and created 5 islands in the Bay of Fundy by slapping his tail in the water and stirring up the earth. And we learned how the world was created on the back of an expanding turtle, and that's why we call it Turtle Island. But everyone knew these creation stories were not to be taken literally. They were quaint yarns spun by primitive people that didn't understand science or logic. The stories did not contain historically accurate truths like other cultures. Advanced cultures that had creation stories like how the world was made in 6 days, and how man was made from dust and woman from his rib. How there was a huge flood and all the animals in the world were put on a boat, but they didn't eat each other. How humans built a skyscraper to heaven and God didn't like it, so he destroyed it, and that's why people speak different languages. You know, the truth. So even though the cultural studies program was somewhat academic, it was important for my development to learn where my people came from, our common history. It instilled in me a sense of Native pride, an awareness of my Native roots. Now, Native programs such as this have been instituted far and wide over the years in schools across the countries, and the benefits have proven to be immeasurable. But why are these programs initiated? Why did the school feel it was necessary for me to make a popsicle stick teepee? I mean, the Indo-Canadian kids weren't pulled out of class to make tandoori. The Asian kids weren't pulled out of class for abacus lessons. The Swiss kids weren't pulled out of class to make pocket knives. So why were the Native kids removed from regular study to learn about their culture? I mean, you would think if any kids needed to maintain their culture, it'd be the ones from immigrant families. I mean, here they are, thousands of miles from their homeland, in a new culture, learning an entirely different history. I mean, wouldn't they be the ones that need cultural studies more than natives? I mean, this is, after all, native land. This is where Aboriginals come from. The landscape is where the ancestors survived from time immemorial. And the languages of their people are the original languages of Canada. I mean, Canada is their home and native land. Am I right? Hurrah, not so fast. Let's consider the profile of the student that is new to Canada. Now generally, and I love wide sweeping generalizations, generally they are here because their family wanted to give them a better chance. They usually fled from war-torn countries or political and religious persecution or from extreme poverty. Their parents generally want them to gain an education, go to university, and become a successful member of society. Education is key, and the Canadian dream is alive and well. And despite the push for Canadian assimilation, these people are very aware of a country of origin, a culture, a language, and roots that they can identify with. I mean, even if people have lived in Canada all of their lives, it doesn't take much for the patriotism of their homeland to rear its head and vote. I mean, you don't believe me? Just check out how many potential wars begin on the streets of any major city when the World Cup is on. Now let's consider the profile of the Aboriginal student. Generally, and remember I love wide sweeping generalizations, Native people originally come from a country of abundance and relative peace. Then with the introduction of colonization, they were faced with war, political and religious persecution, and extreme poverty. They lost their country, their culture, their language, and the roots that they can identify with. Patriotism to Canada? Well, maybe every 4 years during the Olympics, but any other time, not so much. Generally, education is considered destructive, and the Canadian dream is not alive and well. Assimilation to most Native people means becoming an apple, a sellout, or an Uncle Tomahawk. Most Natives don't trust the government, the justice system, or the ideologies on which the country of Canada was founded. In many cases, Native people's relationship with this country is the complete opposite of the majority of Canadians. Now, I am not going to go into a long, drawn-out history of Native-European relations in this country. I mean, we've heard it all before. Natives were here first, Europeans came and took the land, Indians went through hard times, and now we have casinos. Yada, yada, yada. But in discussing Aboriginals in the education system, there is one part of history that I am constantly amazed that few Canadians know nothing about. And yes, I'm talking about that 800-pound bison in the room, residential school. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, I know, groan, yeah. Indians were taken from their families, some bad things happened to them, and now my tax dollars is spent on a bunch of whining Indians because their feelings were hurt. Hey, they were defeated people. They had to learn how to become Canadians eventually. I went to boarding school in England and it gave me character. Residential schools happened a long time, I had nothing to do with it, and those Indians should just get over it. Sounds harsh? Well, I've heard these comments hundreds of times, year after year, from both rednecks and some pretty liberal and enlightened people. So why do natives keep bringing up residential schools? And what effect, if any, did these schools have on students in the year 2011? Well, for one thing, residential schools were not just boarding schools or private schools. There was no wacky hijinks there, like from the likes of Tootie or Joe or Natalie, like on Facts of Life. Residential schools were designed specifically to assimilate Indians into European culture. Or, as Duncan Campbell Scott, the superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, stated, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." Scott also stated that the primary goal of the residential schools was to breed the Indian out of the Indian. The thought being that Indians were a conquered people and native culture and religion was a detriment to their being absorbed into Canadian society. Now, there are a lot of people that suggested at the time the policy was well-meaning, that the government was actually trying to help the natives become productive members of the new and improved Canada. Now, I'd really like to believe that. I'd like to believe that beating the English language out of, or beating the Indian language out of children was just an early precursor to hooked on phonics. Or by cutting off all their hair, which is sacred to native people, they were just doing a makeover a la America's Next Top Model. I'd like to believe that the physical and sexual abuse that occurred in epidemic proportions in these schools were just simple misunderstandings based on the fact that since the children hadn't denounced their heathen ways and accepted full Christianity, that they weren't yet considered humans. So naturally, the rampant abuse and rape of the children wasn't technically a sin. I'd like to believe that the plan to take nomadic hunters and gatherers and force them to become farmers was to prepare them to become competitive in the Canadian economy. The only problem is, at the time, it was illegal for natives to sell their crops off reserve because white farmers were afraid that natives would be a competition. Like, hey, grain bearer, want to buy a potato? Oh, sorry, Red Eagle, I got no money. Want to buy a zucchini? Oh, sorry, grain bearer, I got no money. Oh boy, this whole farming thing is really working out great, eh? I would like to believe that teaching native children about the parliamentary system was going to help them become active in political issues. The problem was that it was illegal for Indians to vote. And I'd like to believe that teaching geography would make these native children aware of the vast and wondrous world that lay outside the confines of the reservations. Oh, wait, natives were actually confined to their reserves by law and had to get permission from an Indian agent to leave. Oh well, at least that's pretty to look at, huh? I'd really like to believe that assimilation was the primary intent of residential schools. But I've never been one to let blind faith get in the way of the facts. I mean, even a brief skimming of history would suggest that the actual intent of the government was to isolate Native people from Canadian society until they just gave up, renounced their treaty status, or more preferably, just simply died off. There didn't seem to be any real desire to introduce education to Natives so they could integrate into mainstream society. Now, to illustrate this, there was a story that was published in the Toronto Star about a resort in Ontario's cottage country. Now, during World War II, the resort was used to house German POWs. But unlike Abu Dhabi, this was no ordinary POW camp. The German captives were allowed to swim freely in the lake and frolic on the beach, a beach that had always been illegal for Indians to step on. The German POWs were also allowed to go to the movies